Hello everyone, and welcome to the second of our video tutorials on criminal process sentencing. In our first video we looked at the aims of sentencing, and in today's video tutorial we'll be looking at the different types of sentence that are available to the court, and also the different factors that the judge will take into account when sentencing the defendant. So if we start by looking at the different types of sentences that are available, there are three key categories. The one that springs to mind is probably custodial sentences, and this is where the defendant is sent to prison for a period of time. Community sentences used to be known as community service, and other would be any sentences available to the court that don't fit within the previous two categories, such as things like driving bans and fines, conditional discharges. But we're going to start off by looking at custodial sentences. Imprisonment is the most severe sentence available to the courts, and as such, custodial sentences are reserved for the most serious offences and are imposed when the offence committed is, quote, so serious that neither a fine alone nor a community sentence can be justified for the offence. And that comes from section 152, subsection 2 of the Criminal Justice Act. And that's what I've got here, that it's a last resort. It's only to be used if a fine or community sentence is inappropriate. Custodial sentences may be imposed where the court believes it's necessary to protect the public, and the length of the sentence depends on the seriousness of the offence and the maximum penalty for the crime allowed by law. There are also some minimum sentences that have been introduced by Parliament for some serious offences, and we're going to have a look at some types of custodial sentence that are available. So if we look at a life sentence to begin with, we know that for murder there's a mandatory life sentence, which means that the judge must issue a life sentence if the defendant is convicted for murder. When a court passes a life sentence, it means that the offender will be subject to that sentence for the rest of their life. And when passing a life sentence, a judge must specify the minimum term, sometimes called the tariff, an offender must spend in prison before becoming eligible to apply for parole. The only exception to this is when a life sentence is passed with a whole life order, meaning that such an offender will spend the rest of their life in prison. An example of that would be one of the Lee Rigby killers was given a life sentence, whole life. So there was no tariff attached to his, whereas the other Lee Rigby killer received a life sentence with a tariff of 45 years. Discretionary life sentence is where the judge can give a life sentence, but they don't have to. An example of that we've studied would be manslaughter. So they can get anything up to life. Extended sentences were sentences introduced to provide extra protection to the public in certain types of cases where the court has found that an offender is dangerous and an extended licence period is required to protect the public from a risk of harm. And there the judge would decide how long the offender should stay in prison and also fixes the extended licence period up to a maximum of 8 years. And the offender will either be entitled to automatic release at the 2/3 point of their custodial sentence or be entitled to apply for parole at that point. We've also got fixed term sentences known as determinate prison sentences, and this is where the court sets a fixed length for the prison sentence and is the most common type of prison sentence. So for an example, an offender might be sentenced to 4 years in prison. This could be the maximum period of time the offender could spend in prison. However, the offender will not necessarily spend the whole of this time in prison. They can get out on good behaviour prior to that point. So offenders sentenced to 2 years or more will serve half their sentence in prison, and they'll serve the rest of that sentence in the community on licence. The sorts of crimes that you would give as examples of attracting custodial sentences, obviously indictable offences, murder, rape, robbery, section 18, logical ones to give as examples of being the most serious so using a custodial sentence. Be aware as well that for custodial sentences, suspended sentences also fall within this category. And when a court imposes a custodial sentence of anywhere between 14 days and 2 years, the court can choose to suspend the sentence for up to 2 years. And that means that the offender doesn't go to prison immediately, but they're given the chance to stay out of trouble and to comply with up to 12 requirements set by the court. And if the offender doesn't comply with the requirements, or they're convicted of another offence during the suspension period, they're likely to serve the original custodial term in addition to the sentence they got for the new offence. In 2017, 53,148 offenders had a suspended sentence order imposed, representing about 4% of offenders sentenced. One of the big debates really to do with custodial sentences is the discussion about whether life should mean life. So we know that a life sentence for murder means that they will be on licence for life and they'll usually have a set tariff. But there are lots of people that believe that life sentences should mean whole life. And there are some quite interesting cases that you can have a look at on this issue. There's Anderson and the Secretary of State for the Home Department. And in this case, it shows you that in the past, it was the Home Secretary who decided when a person sentenced to life should be released. And in this case here, that was found to be in breach of human rights. And in Winter, the European Court of Human Rights held that prisoners cannot be given whole life tariffs with no prospect of release. And that was a bit of a surprising decision. And actually, the European Court of Human Rights has actually changed its mind on that. So this shows just how, I suppose, controversial this issue is, how even the European Court of Human Rights isn't really clear on how it feels about mandatory whole life sentences. Hutchinson in the UK, 2015, you can see that the court overruled Winter and said that whole life sentences are only incompatible with the Convention on Human Rights if there's no possibility of review. So at the moment, we can give life with whole life, but it'd be interesting for you to sort of look at the arguments for and against that. And that might be something you want to research as part of your independent study. Look at our next type of sentence then. We're on to community sentences. And a community sentence combines punishment with activities carried out in the community. And it can include one or more of a number of requirements that I've listed here for you. And they could be carrying out up to 300 hours of unpaid work, which might include things like removing graffiti, clearing overgrown grass. This is the unpaid work requirement. It can also include things such as requiring the offender to have alcohol or drug treatment. And that's obviously aiming to tackle the reasons why they've committed the crimes in the first place. There might be, for instance, a curfew requirement, which aims to keep the offender out of trouble. And overall, these requirements are aiming to punish offenders, to change offenders' behaviour so they don't commit crime in the future, and also to make some reparation or amends to the victim of crime or the local community. 2017, 95,112 offenders were sentenced to a community sentence, which represented 8% of offenders sentenced. So if we look at our other type of sentence available to the courts, classed as other, we'll start off with fines. Fines are a sentence that are available to the courts, and they are the most common type of sentence given. And that's because they're given for lower level crimes that are common, such as minor driving offences or theft. The amount is set by the court after considering the seriousness of the offence and how much money the offender can pay. And fines can be given to organisations or companies as well as people. And the maximum fine allowed in both magistrates' courts and the Crown Court is unlimited apart from offences sentenced in the Magistrates' Court which were committed before 2015, where the maximum fine is £5,000. In 2017, 75% of all offenders received a fine, a total of 896,611 offenders. Charges then are given for the least serious offences, such as very minor thefts. The court may give an absolute discharge, which means it decides not to impose a punishment because the experience of going to court is seen as punishment enough. However, the offender still gets a criminal record. Whereas a conditional discharge can also be given, and this means that if the offender commits another crime, they can be sentenced for the first offence and the new one. And in 2017, 53,104 defendants were given a discharge, representing 4% of all of these sentences. And driving bans are another option available for sentencing defendants. It might be a permanent ban or a ban for a certain number of years or an order to retake a driving test. And a really useful activity to do at this point would be to pause the video here and create a grid where you are evaluating the advantages and the disadvantages of the different types of sentence that we've just discussed, because it could be that you get a 15 marker asking you to analyse the most effective type of sentence available. The final element of sentencing that we need to look at today are the factors that are taken into account by the judge when he's issuing a sentence. So, two key factors that you need to be aware of. Aggravating factors are things that make the offence worse and therefore the sentence is higher, whereas mitigating factors go in the defendant's favour and therefore the sentence is lower. And in your booklets, I've given you a whole list of different factors that might present themselves in a case, and it'd be really useful to pause the video at this point and decide whether each of the factors I've given you are aggravating, making the sentence higher, or mitigating, making the sentence lower. Okay, so once you've had a go at that, the last thing for us to consider today is the role of the Sentencing Guidelines Council. And the Sentencing Guidelines Council was set up by the Criminal Justice Act in 2003, and its role is to issue guidelines on sentencing which the courts must follow unless it's in the interests of justice not to do so. And I'm just going to switch screens very quickly here just to show you their website, which I recommend that you have a look at. Okay, so I've just switched screens here so I can show you the Sentencing Council's website. You can find them really easily online, and it's a really good website actually. It's very easy to follow and to understand, and I recommend you have a look at it because it's quite interesting. There's also a number of little videos that you can watch on here that show how offenders are sentenced, and they're quite easy to understand because they're made for the public. You can also click on various links like this one, where they'll give you sentencing guidelines for the magistrates' courts, or if you want to look at guidelines for the Crown Court, and you can look at guidelines for particular offences here. So that's quite interesting to have a look at. And there's some useful links you can look at how sentences are worked out. This is looking at exactly what we've been just looking at, the factors taken into account. It's looking at the aims of sentencing as well. Again, there's a little video clip here that you can watch to see how a judge uses the sentencing guidelines. A video here on factors influencing the sentence. So all of this really useful to look at. So I've just switched back to my PowerPoint again here, and that rounds up our video tutorial for today. So today we've looked at the different types of sentences that are available to the courts, and that's custodial, community and other. And we've also been looking at the factors that the court take into account, which are mitigating and aggravating factors. And as I've said, I do urge you to go and have a look at the Sentencing Guidelines Council and use their website to help supplement the notes that you've already got.